Thank you. Good morning. It's good to be here down in Hobart again. I seem to visit Hobart quite often, and it's always a pleasure to be here. So this morning, Tom has given me this topic about translating research into innovation and what the essential ingredients are for success. So I want to give some background to the innovation process itself. To talk about innovation systems, which is an approach to understanding innovation. And then I want to go ahead and talk about how those innovation systems can be applied to the work that we all do. So initially, I want to talk about innovation as being quite clearly the desired outcome of applied research. We do research in order to have innovation, whether we particularly are mindful of that or not. And by innovation, I'm really talking about change in practice. And we can sometimes get fooled in thinking about the word innovation. So for a particular company, a business, a producer in this state of cherries or strawberries, there's a change in their practice. For a large company or a large organisation, innovation could be something completely different. It would include that, but might also include something, about the way that they actually do business. And sometimes we can get fooled by thinking that the adjective innovative is the same as innovation. So you may use an innovative technique in your research. That means you've done an innovation in your research. It doesn't mean that you've actually done an innovation in practice in a business. So this is, when we do research, we don't necessarily get innovation. And this is an opinion piece that was in the Times of London a number of years ago. I happened to come across in reading the Times in an airport or an aeroplane somewhere, that this heading struck me: "Don't expect public science to lay golden eggs." If you put government money into research, you don't necessarily get technology and growth as your reward. And that's quite a sobering thought. What is the government doing if they're putting money into research? Here in this room, I think we probably frequently think the government should supply more money for research. If we're going to have innovation, then we have to have research. But this is a sobering message that just because you put money into research, you don't necessarily get innovation coming out at the end. Can I do something other than use the mouse? I can use that. Okay. Recently, the Australian government has produced this report in a group called Innovation and Science Australia, a performance review of the Australian innovation system. And they've divided the innovation system, and notice that they're using the word innovation system, at three levels: about knowledge creation, knowledge transfer, and knowledge application. And this report is looking at various KPIs about knowledge development and knowledge transfer and knowledge application, and are judging Australia against other OECD countries and saying, are we in the first quartile? Because obviously we would like to think of ourselves in the first quartile, the first 25% of countries in doing innovation. Are we in the second quartile, or are we in the bottom half? And what you can see here is that for knowledge creation, we have 2 out of the 7. We're in the first quartile, and the other 5 we're in the middle. But as we go to knowledge transfer, we have a few more KPIs that are in the bottom half. And if we go to, lastly, knowledge application, quite decidedly in Australia, our KPIs are in the bottom half of world rankings. So right at the outset, I would say to you that Australia has a poor record of turning research into innovation. And for the purpose of today, I want to suggest that that isn't somebody else's fault. Let's concentrate on thinking about what we can do about that. The government has a number of policies, and the government does have an innovation policy. You know, the work that's being done here in the training centre, the work of the ARC, the work of FIAL, of CSIRO, all fit into a national innovation system. And it's worth having a look at some of these things and understanding what they're trying to do. The Australian government does have an innovation policy, is trying to put the settings in place to ensure that innovation and economic prosperity comes out at the end. In some ways, this Innovation Training Research Centre is what in innovation studies in government policy gets called a policy instrument. You're an experiment. You're an experiment of a policy instrument. Is doing research the way that's set up in this centre a good way to do research? Is it productive? Does it lead to innovation and change and economic well-being? And if you know, it's not the government is deciding that it really likes research. The government wants to see more research. It wants to see more papers. So as researchers, as students, as a university, we might be very, very happy about this centre. But if it doesn't contribute to the government's innovation policy, then the government will seek another way to ensure that innovation occurs. And so, very decidedly, innovation is the desired outcome of applied research. Now, I want to present to you this idea about innovation systems. It's the work that I did for my PhD, but it fits into a very large area of academic work and practical work about how innovation occurs. And we know that the innovation systems failure frameworks that I'm going to describe actually provide a prediction of innovation outcome. And so for that reason, they're quite valuable. Now, innovation systems are quite a well-accepted approach. They're several different levels. And I like this definition up here from Charles Edquist, a Swede. The Northern Europeans, the Dutch, the Swedes, are very much into this. But it is a conceptual framework to describe, understand, explain, and perhaps influence the processes of innovation. So it's both an analytical approach, a framework, a conceptual approach, and also something that should have some sort of reality and some effect on innovation performance. And the diagram that I've shown here is one that uses the approaches of sectoral innovation systems and technological innovation systems, which are two approaches that I've looked at in my PhD. And the sectoral approaches has these number of elements, and technological And I'm not going to explain them all now because I'm going to come back to them afterwards. But these elements have been proposed as the elements of an innovation system that need to be present or sufficiently present or active at the right time in order for innovation to occur. When we're talking about innovation, classically there are 5 different kinds of innovation, and these were proposed by Joseph Schumpeter in I think 1912. He was the Austrian Minister for Finance at one stage in the 1920s. And these have stood the test of time. New products, which I think we all understand, new processes for doing things, and many of you are probably working on new processes. I've called here new supply chains. But Joseph Schumpeter talked about new sources of raw materials and new markets to exploit. So that's why there are 5, because he divided those. I think today we would call those supply chains. And I think here in the room we have supply chains very much in mind. And new business processes, new ways of organising business. And I think sometimes if we only think about new products and new processes, we can miss the significant benefit that can come to companies and to the economy by changing of business practices. So I just want to now spend a little bit talking about the work that I did for my PhD, and particularly applying these innovation systems concepts to projects. And so often these innovation systems ideas have been applied to national innovation systems or to regional economies, to looking at new technologies overall or innovation in a particular sector of the economy. But I wanted to apply them to projects and understand how they worked with projects. And in short, I found that these innovation systems ideas can be applied quite well to the project level. And I did this by conducting a number of case studies. I looked at research projects that have been conducted by Meat and Livestock Australia, where we hoped to have some sort of change in the industry as an outcome. Half of the money that I spend comes from industry levies. The other half comes from the government, so there are obviously high expectations on innovation as an outcome. I collected data on these projects by conducting a survey of all the people that I could think of who'd been involved in some way in the project. And when I'm talking about the project, I'm not just talking about the research that was done in the laboratory, but perhaps the industry or the government people who may have had knowledge of the project, who may have given some advice. And we used some snowballing techniques of then when people completed the survey saying, do you know anybody else who may have been involved? And we increased the number of people. So we were getting multiple perspectives on the project. And more than half of the respondents to the survey were people other than the researchers. And essentially I was asking, did innovation occur? And using the very typical sort of 7-point Likert scale, from agree to disagree with a number of statements, and also asking about these innovation system elements. And so my first job, and then lastly, the analysis I used was to use fuzzy sets. So to ask, was a project in the set of innovation or was it not in the set of innovation? But fuzzy sets allow you to say to what degree is it in the set of innovation. So you might be 100% sure this project led to innovation, so that's fine. But there's ones where you may not be so sure. So you might assign a value of it's 0.8 in the set or 0.6 in the set. And I did that both for what we call the antecedent conditions, those innovation system elements, as well as for the outcome. And this is a method called qualitative comparative analysis, which has been gaining popularity. and is very, very suitable when you've got multiple case studies and you're trying to look at what conditions lead to an outcome, or what set of conditions lead to an outcome. And the innovation systems theory is that in the case of the sectoral systems, was that all these 5 elements needed to be sufficiently present to get innovation, or in the case of technological systems, all 7 have to be present. So in terms of sets, it's, you know, condition 1 and condition 2 and 3 and 4 in order to get innovation. And this is one of the diagrams from when I was testing the theory. And so don't start trying to do an R squared or anything like that, because that isn't how it works. So on the x-axis is membership of all the functional conditions. So how much was this project, so every dot is a project, how much was that project in the set of all conditions are present? And to what extent was it a member of the set of, yes, there was an innovative outcome? And what you can see in this diagram is very much, if a project is more in the set of, yes, all of the conditions are present, then it's much more in the set of, yes, innovation occurred. And if it's in the set of, you know, no, these innovation, some factor or factors of that, you know, were not present, you know, then we're quite sure it's outside, or it's looking like it's outside the set of innovation having occurred. We then went on to look at, if you wanted to have a certain level of certainty that innovation occurred, in the cases where innovation didn't occur, what conditions most often failed? And I also did that by qualitative comparative analysis, but the analysis takes a little time to explain. We also looked at looking at risk and the relative risk of failure, and the two correlated quite well. And so that's what I've shown you here, that among the structural elements in sectoral innovation systems, interactions and markets both had a relative risk of failure of 3. They were 3 times more likely to have no innovation outcome if interactions were weak or market signals were weak. And the p-value for that is less than 0.05. In looking at the functional elements, these functions of knowledge development and direction of the search, similarly, were the ones that were significantly more likely. Now, that information is very situated to the research program that I was running, the projects that I was looking at. They were all projects I was responsible for running. So if I have to give, the short summary of what I did for my PhD, was that I researched how I've been doing my job so badly. And so, on sober reflection, I have to say to myself, how did I not do a good enough job of these things? Or is it that no matter how hard I may have tried, this was never going to work? And that's kind of a sobering thoughts to have. But I think you can see that if you can have some reflection and answer those questions, then you start to put yourself in a position where you're more likely to get innovation as an outcome. So the model that I ended up with sort of in my PhD work really was this one, that we think about research leading to innovation, that I could have these conditions from both the structural and functional approaches, that leads to innovation system performance, and then innovation occurs. So if I'm thinking at the project level about how am I going to not just get an output of my research, how am I not just going to get a PhD, how am I not just going to get 5 publications, how am I actually going to have some impact on the industry because industry has taken this up and made a change, then this is what I need to have in between, if you like, that output and the innovation occurring. So I want to think about that, but I just before I do, I just want to move to this. One other thing that I looked at in my PhD was about the role of intermediaries. Now, I've put a definition up here. It's actually from Wikipedia, because I actually found that it was probably the best condensed sort of definition that I had. The role of firms, agencies and individuals that facilitate innovation by providing the bridging that necessary to bring together a range of different organisations to create successful innovation. So successful innovation doesn't just happen. It doesn't just happen because you've got these elements present, though you might have noticed one of the elements was interaction. And I think that's very much the role of this intermediary. They do get called different things, and there are some interesting papers looking at the different kinds of intermediaries, but they're people, agents, firms that bring people together, bring together the needs and the solution. I think the role of intermediaries in bringing together all of those elements of an innovation system and making sure that they're working sufficiently well. When I looked at the 41 projects that MLA had looked at in terms of food safety, and I'd asked everybody who was involved in this project, which actor, which group, which people were involved, and which ones were effective, then these numbers 1, 2 and 4 that are in red were seen as being most involved. The researchers, so no surprise there, industry firms, and 4 being the intermediary, being MLA. And I guess that's a good thing that we were seen as being involved. The dark lines, or the lines, the arrows, and particularly the heavy lines, are where one actor saw the other actor as being effective in the innovation system. And you know, not surprisingly, researchers were seen as being involved and effective, because after all, we were conducting innovation, conducting research to lead to innovation, but also the role of Meat and Livestock Australia, number 4, the intermediary in making things happen. And if we weren't seen as being sufficiently effective, which sometimes we weren't, then again, those projects were more likely to be the ones that didn't lead to an innovation outcome. And so I challenge you to think in your work, who is the intermediary? And if there isn't one, it could very well be you. And it's not necessarily a role that you're comfortable with. It might not be a role that you feel particularly well trained for, but I'm going to try to give you a quick overview on how you can use this kind of research to think about the work that you do, and try to make things happen, at least by asking questions. So I want to go and talk now about how the innovation systems failure frameworks can be used. First of all, in your professional practice. Now, I've given you, right at the back of your book, is this list and of very quick definitions of the innovation system elements. Now, I did a quick experiment at MLA last year for a workshop within my team, which at the time covers a whole lot of different technologies. And two things. Giving this kind of definition, people were able to identify what they thought was the failing condition for most of the projects that failed. So it did seem to work in other areas, and so I'd encourage you to look at this, and for your project, think about the big picture about innovation happening, and just ask yourself, are all of these things present? Are these things working? And if not, what can we do to make this better? The second way that you can use this as a more analytical tool in planning, in managing the work that's done. So this is a thing more for centre directors and for the other sponsors that are here, is that you can have these structural, functional frameworks, these theories of innovation systems. You have a network of actors and an intermediary, and you've got to make all of this work, and it's got to work right from the input stage. It isn't just something that happens when the research report comes out of the research. The innovation doesn't start, when you submit your PhD thesis. Innovation doesn't start when the paper is accepted for publication. It starts way back here and has already started for this training centre and works all the way through. So I think it can be very well used for in that way. And lastly, I think it's very useful as a research tool, and I'm keen to be able to continue working in this area. I think there's a number of questions that could be answered. Firstly, will this innovation system work at the project level for other sectors and other technologies? I feel quite confident that it will, but at the moment I've only really tested it for the kinds of work that I've been doing with food safety. It seems very roughly to work for my colleagues who are working in other areas of technology where, in MLA, where of course there's a strong intermediary. But how widely is it applicable? I'd like to understand how these innovation system elements work together over time to produce an innovation outcome. So I don't think you need all of them all of the time. You need to have them at the right time. There's some work that's been done particularly on the functional innovation, functional approaches that talk about motors of innovation, and asking out of the 7 elements, which are the ones that are really the motors and really making and really driving it. And I think that's still an open question, and I wouldn't be surprised if the answers aren't different in different circumstances. And I think it's also worth asking the question from a research point of view of how can weaknesses be identified and then overcome during the course of a project? Because we don't, while we might get some academic kudos and satisfaction out of doing a post-mortem on projects and saying why ones in the past have failed, I think the prize is really in understanding how we can identify problems during the course of a project and make changes so that we actually do end up with an innovation outcome rather than consigning it to the group of failures. So there's some ideas on how these innovation systems failure frameworks can be used, and some further research that's needed. So in this presentation I've tried to cover these 3 areas to talk about innovation and the necessity of that for applied research, to introduce you to the idea of innovation systems and the world that's out there. I've given you a number of research papers that I think are reasonably seminal in the area. Can be a little bit tricky to read, I have to admit, but I've tried to give ones that I think are reasonably readable, and then lastly to talk about how we can apply them. And I think that's something that we can all do. as we think about our work and what it means and where it should go. So thank you, and I'm very happy to take questions and discussion.